I am almost intimidated by these wonderful, wonderful ladies, but I am so thankful that they were willing to come here today and have a very frank conversation about the future of philanthropy. So I'm hoping if you guys are open to it, let's get into it. I'm going to go ahead and start with my first question. The last few years have changed the landscape that we all operate in. We're all still learning how to manage the realities of today. What are you guys experiencing in your organizations? And how are you finding your path forward?
Thank you. First, I want to thank Beneficial State Bank and for having us today on this lovely Monday afternoon. So the pandemic it was tough. It was really tough. It was, when things started to roll out, we really were doing a lot of hand-wringing, because we knew what the impact would be on our Indigenous communities. Being marginalized and under-resourced, they would be very hard hit, and that's exactly what happened. And so we launched our crisis fund with $50,000 from Seattle Foundation. And it went up from there, and thank God we had a lot of really beautiful donations, and Seattle Foundation really stepped up to do the All in Washington campaign. And but it was tiring. It was very, very tiring and exhausting for the staff. But I would say once the crisis began to kind of I don't want to say be over, but once it started to subside a bit, we were able to take a breath and think about how we could begin to build infrastructure in Indian country so that the next pandemic or whatever the crisis would be, we would maybe be better prepared. So we were able to do grant making for the last couple of years around Native food sovereignty and food systems, around green infrastructure, and our biggest one is the power of ceremony, because it was also a very difficult time for our spiritual leaders. No one resources them financially, and they had a very, very heavy load. And so we were able to get quite a bit of money out the door, and what that told us was that we kind of woke up grassroots communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. And we got millions and millions of dollars in applications. And that told us that work is really happening on the ground, and that those community leaders have vision, they have solutions, they are ready to work. They just needed resourcing. And so we, of course, didn't have enough money to cover all of the applications, like whoever does, but I think our learnings through that was that the way that we've been doing grant making was kind of the mainstream approach. It just isn't working for us. When I would look at the declines and where they were and what they were proposing, it just was heartbreaking. It was absolutely heartbreaking that we didn't have enough resources to fund some of these amazing, amazing projects. Communities where they're just so isolated and underrepresented. And so we've been doing some analysis, and we're going to try grant making a different way. We are going to launch a new fund coming up this year to support Indigenous lifeways. And it'll be a rolling application. We're not going to have a start and a stop and a decline and accept, and we're just going to keep it open and continue to fundraise and get as much money as we can. And included in that will be food sovereignty, food systems. That is by far our largest fund. And more requests come in around food, which is amazing to hear, right? That is really some sustainability. Our power of ceremony, and we're going to be refocusing on youth, Native youth, and working on leadership, capacity building, and community. And I'll let you know how it goes. We're gonna really give it a go. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Who's next?
Hello, can everyone hear me? Thank you all for being here on a Monday after work. Yeah, I mean, just out the gate to that question, I think the most important thing, at least at the Social Justice Fund, what we recognized was in the pandemic, there was really an onset of compassion fatigue across the board. We had to do some internal recognition of where we are or where we are going as an organization. And that meant for us to actually examine the need to really walk through our values. And our values were asking of us to be more liberation focused, particularly Black liberatory focused. And so we shifted from a 5-day work week to a 4-day work week. Some of the other things we started learning is prioritizing really what the pulse of what our grantee community was actually saying. And what that actually, I think, carved out was the spaciousness to really focus on improving our grant-making processes, but also not just kind of be in that gear of wanting to be performative and just put out things, because let's just say this work can get busy. But more importantly, I think there's a piece here of ensuring that you keep that integrity of, you know, whether it's a strategic plan, whether you're examining your values, whether you're looking at where's our moral compass going. We recognize that something about this pandemic caused us to actually pause, because a civil rights chapter was asking more of us. It was asking us, how are we going to show up? And ultimately, what is the legacy forward? And that also opened up a door for us to be thinking critically about ensuring our grantee communities, the ones that are most impacted on the front lines, like our Black trans community members, folks with disabilities, folks who are from our immigrant community, were being supported. Because ultimately, one of the biggest things that we heard was really this push to ensure that resources actually came through funding that was unrestricted, because there were folks who were like, you know, realistically, I can't really stay in said organization because, you know, I got to keep the lights on and we're not being funded well. And so these are the conversations we've had with donors, with ourselves, and with folks in the community. And we're just looking forward to seeing, particularly once November comes, what the landscape of things will also look like.
Well, I also want to thank you all for hosting us, and for you all for joining and giving us an opportunity to kind of share our experiences. And as I listen to my fellow panelists, I hear a big piece was really a reevaluation of the roles and responsibility of philanthropy, a questioning of our systems, and a holding philanthropy to a higher degree of responsibility around how we do our work. I see a big move to decenter philanthropists, decenter foundations, and really center the communities that are in need, and a questioning of the systems that we've been using in the past, and requiring ourselves to work into community to figure out what are the new systems, what are better ways of getting the outcomes that our communities really need. So that's, I think, a big shift that's happened related to the pandemic, to climate change, to the racial injustice that we experienced all at the same time. And I think those systems have shifted enough that they'll remain, but there is a lot of work to kind of support them, to continue learning what works and what doesn't work. The system works as designed, and so we have to institutionalize a different way of thinking about things and working in partnership to really get to the needs of community.
These are all really powerful thoughts and feelings, and It's important for us as stewards in our community, too, to share these feelings because so many of us feel like we're alone in that, right? And it's our power is in numbers. So, with all those thoughts, oh, Kat? Oh, yes, Nancy.
I'm going to speak to this question from the standpoint of the organizations that 501 Commons serves. So we touch about 2,000 organizations each year. That includes organizations we've been working with continuously for over a decade and organizations that just come for some one thing or a question to get answered or a training or give big and or a more limited relationship. But collectively, with all of those organizations, we spend a lot of time with our head under the hood, actually looking at what's happening in nonprofits. And what I see happening is sort of the second stage of the pandemic. It's a secondary impact from the amount of stress that the sector was under during the pandemic, which all in all, I think we did an amazing job as a sector. I mean, people, they didn't just pivot, which was a word you heard a lot. I referred to it as a pirouette, which is we actually got off the ground, turned 360 degrees around, and we landed with aplomb and managed to figure out how to keep going with our missions, how to support staff, how to support community, and how to do really creative work. So the amount of resilience and grit that you always see in nonprofits was in full evidence. But now we're in a stage where nonprofits are facing 4 challenges. And these challenges are things we all have to grapple with because I personally don't see a way that we get out of this through any kind of independent action by philanthropy, by government, by nonprofits, by the business community, by the community in general. Because we don't have any way that we have collective planning about the future of nonprofits. It's just kind of survival of the fittest, and that is not a way to run a sector that does all the important work that our sector does. In terms of the 4 challenges, the first one is declining donors, so that issue of compassion fatigue. We're seeing at a national scale. So the number of people who are participating as donors is down to the lowest level since 1995. And this has been an ongoing trend, but it's been precipitous since the end of the pandemic. Part of this is because the incentive has gone away. 95% of people do not file a tax return where they itemize, and so there's no tax incentive that we can use to kind of push people, especially around year-end giving. Part of it is just people disengaging from the community around them because we've had this disruption in relationships, and part of it is the cost of living. But we are seeing the biggest drop-off in the 80% of donors who give less than $500, and those are the donors that primarily support community-based nonprofits. The second thing that happened was there was a big shift in volunteerism, and the nonprofit workforce is primarily a volunteer workforce. Of the 54,000 nonprofits in Washington State, only about 6,000 have even one employee. So most of the people who work in nonprofits get a wage of exactly 0. And I always remind people when we were talking about staffing, with staff about staff pay, which is the next thing I'm going to go to, that is true, that most of what nonprofits bring to our community is done entirely with volunteer labor. But there are fewer volunteers, and volunteers are less likely to make long-term commitments, which is really disrupting our ability to deliver services, to innovate, and to stay connected to community. The third thing is just increased costs. So nonprofits are facing rapidly increased costs just like families are, but with very little leeway as to how those costs get paid for, especially because most of them are not funded through grants or contracts. They're the things that are left out of the grants and contracts, like insurance costs or technology costs. And then the fourth thing is we have a workforce that is amazingly satisfied with their work. They're proud of their work. They want to work in the nonprofit sector. They feel like they're making a difference, but they're finding it increasingly impossible to stay in the sector. And we were losing people from nonprofits to other related nonprofit sectors, to government, to philanthropy, to education and healthcare, because we have a very talented, very educated workforce in nonprofits, but it's very hard to retain them in community-based nonprofits where the pay is so much lower than those other sectors, in large part because most of those other sectors are highly unionized and wages are therefore better. We're seeing in Seattle that the average cost of living in Seattle is 54% above the rest of the country. The minimum wage went up by 3% last year, but the MIT calculation of the rise in the living wage, what it takes to live just kind of a basic life in Seattle, jumped over 20%. And nonprofits can't keep up with that kind of pressure on our employees. So we're dealing with a lot of turnover, a lot of loss of talent, a lot of loss of experience and disruption all the time, and that is very stressful. And so we're also seeing just kind of breakdowns in the fabric of organizations that used to have a lot of cohesion and a lot of, a sense of kind of driving purpose, but it's getting more and more difficult to hold on to that cohesion as there's turnover and loss. If you take all those factors together, and there's really nothing on the horizon that indicates that any of those are going to get better, I'm very concerned about how the nonprofit sector is going to go forward in the next decade and beyond. And I think putting this question to philanthropy is a good question to place, at the doors of philanthropic institutions. But there's no way that philanthropy, given that philanthropy is such a small part of the overall source of revenue for nonprofits, can solve this problem for us. So my concern is really where we go from here. What do we do and how do we do it together? Because independently, we're not, any of us, likely to be able to overcome these forces.
Powerful response there. So that actually brings me to my second question. To transform our economy and create a world where everyone can thrive, we need to transform business. That said, we need a robust government sector and nonprofit sector to do that. What needs to change today and in the long run to make philanthropy more effective? Kat?
Stacy. First of all, thank you, Stacy. You combine unbelievable strategic execution with graciousness. And thanks, Katie Taylor, behind the scenes, working hard on this. Thanks to all our colleagues at Beneficial State Bank for doing this hard work every day with joy and effectiveness. And thank you all for joining today. So I'm kind of the stinker on the panel. I think these very well-informed diagnoses of the challenges that nonprofit grant recipients face reveal some of the failings of philanthropy. Not that there aren't incredible organizations, many of them in this room, doing the difficult and essential work of alleviating suffering, creating opportunity, and restoring self-determination. I would never mean to impugn the hardworking staffs and urgent management of laudable philanthropy. But structurally, and mostly in practice, philanthropy is failing us, especially at this time, epically. So as a philanthropy principal, I think it's my responsibility to interrogate what is going wrong and hold myself accountable to what could go right. So I'm going to talk about the paradox of philanthropy, too. And I'm sorry to be reading, but I want to get this right. I want to be a constructive critic of my own sector and move towards something to build a better future for philanthropy and therefore all of the organizations who depend upon it. So, okay, what's wrong with philanthropy? It's part charity, it's mostly subsidy. By design, philanthropy enjoys fabulous tax benefits. Just to take one example, the most rapidly rising charitable vehicle, the Donor Advised Fund, or DAFs as we call them, pay neither income, capital gains, nor inheritance tax. It's estimated that up to 72 cents of every dollar of DAF contributed is actually provided by the taxpayer. In other words, foregone government tax proceeds, which could otherwise be invested in avoiding the problems that charity claims to want to clean up in the first place. Number 2, the tail won't wag the dog. We give 5% away to address the ills that we create, and how we invest the 100% if we don't divest from the harm and invest in the good. Without that, philanthropy through conventional investing is actually perpetuating and aggravating our problems, including climate change and injustice. Insufficient time to get the work done. On top of the basic paradoxes of charity, it has always been whimsical, moving from cause to cause in 3 years or less, which is not a time frame conducive to addressing root causes. This ADD plus corporate whimsy meant our collective commitment to racial equity turned out to be largely rhetorical. 3, undermining sustainability, which was mentioned, all of these have been mentioned more politely. We impoverish with non-living wage jobs the very workers we hope will change the world. We pay not at all the millions of us holding up the caring, sharing, and creative economies. Sidestepping accountability. In the largest and most long-standing national foundations, donor intent traps us in outdated missions and failed models. And working charities are increasingly separated from their donors through intermediaries like DAF hosts who inadvertently obscure those donors from their accountability for the resources they have diverted from elected government. Perpetuating incumbency. And those who have the power to change the status quo rarely do, because it's from whence their power comes. We can't expect a consolidating, concentrating industry like philanthropy to upend the very forces that put it in place in the first place. Of course, it's not fair to pin all responsibility on the charitable sector. Business, which I spend most of my time thinking about, drives more societal outcomes than philanthropy and government combined. But the fundamental paradoxes of philanthropy may explain, present company accepted, why it has not been able over the last 150 years to prevent the at least 5 cascading and overlapping crises worldwide that we are having today. Clearly, we need deep reform of philanthropy, but in the meantime, there are serious steps we can take. As Leonard Cohen wrote, look for the cracks, that's where the light gets in. So here are the rays of light that I see. It's time to focus on the vaunted assets of philanthropy, 1.2 trillion in private foundations and nearly 300 billion in the donor-advised funds. These are the pools of financial or real assets that earn money over time. They are the same as those that create passive income for wealthy people to persist through lean times and provide resiliency. These assets should perform those functions for communities of people, especially those from whom they were stripped. But we have to shift them to do so. While funding symptoms relief will remain critical, we have to use our philanthropic assets to effect deep systems change that stops the harm in the first place and creates the conditions to thrive for all people and communities. In adopting trust-based philanthropy, starting with trusting the communities who have been hurt the first, worst, and longest to understand comprehensively and viscerally the problems and therefore populate the best and largest solution sets. That's where we should be going. Inadequately capitalizing and resourcing frontline communities and high-performing nonprofits to change, for a change, to realize their full potential to thrive, not just survive. Some examples of help on the way: $600 billion of Biden administration passed funding across 18 federal agencies, most of them covered by Justice 40 commitments that we should be getting to those frontline communities ASAP. And I will note the Milken Institute has a fantastic matching tool to get that done. And aligning government procurement with public purpose. School Meals for All, for instance, that put BIPOC farmers in the supply chain of our biggest public expenditure programs. We can create operating entities to give us insight of the actual actors in these systems requiring change. Not everybody has to start a bank, but when one does, let's share those learnings. In shifting assets and therefore power, not just to other people, but also collectively controlled and governed organizations like community DAFs, community foundations, land trusts, community land trusts, microgrids in rural communities. These shared assets could lead to less desperation and more self-determination. When everyone owns a little bit of everything and no one owns too much of anything, we just might come round right. In shifting our own assets to community control through the Good Life Pledge, which commits 30% of our assets, my husband's and mine, to community control and governance in our lifetime, to complement the Good Life Pledge that said we would give at least half of our income away. So I'm sorry to drone on and on about this, but I think I see the world through systems, and I think it's time for systemic structural change to philanthropy to empower the work that you've heard of on this stage and get at the problems that have been identified so well.
That was a lot of thoughts. I love it. And I know we're recording this, so you guys all can take copious notes when we get back. Ladies, what are your thoughts on what she just said? As nonprofits, how do you feel about that? Do you feel she's saying that in the right direction?
Uh-huh.
All right. I'm gonna go with that with uh-huh. So we're gonna move on to our third question. During the pandemic and during the uprisings, a lot of communities were made to move wealth to Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. We are seeing more and more of those programs sunset. What do we do to advocate for more investment around these commitments going forward and post this somewhat scary election upon us? Who wants to start?
Go. I think what comes to mind when I think of 2020, I think globally there was a movement in that moment because there was a level of pausing and people were really thinking about, the relationship to, for example, America's original sin and really thinking about the racial violence that has harmed historically Native communities, Black communities, Brown communities. And I think that there was an ask, or there were folks who were like, I'm gonna make this commitment, whether it be corporations, businesses, nonprofits. That was in 2020. Here we are in 2024. An election is upon us, and many spaces have named, I think we did our part. We did that racial equity thing, it was great. The DEI thing was fun. We're sunsetting to something else. But yet, racial violence still continues in our country. And I actually think there is a deeper ask here around when people were brought up to speed or told specifically from Brown, Black, and Native communities about the state of what was happening in our country. There was a time I felt where people were either listening or maybe leaning to being potentially slightly performative. And I think it's going to be quite interesting come November, what kinds of conversations are being had. Because what this to me at least speaks to is we cannot keep prescribing Tylenol when the country is literally having a heart attack. And we're seeing that same surge happen again and again and again, where we are actually seeing social political movements that are purposely actually trying to undermine Black and Brown and Native communities. And I really think that this actually speaks to more so, again, going back to that moral compass, collectively, of folks actually taking a stance. Because whether or not we decide or we say, I don't want to talk about politics, fine. But politics is always talking about you. It's choosing where you get to live. It's choosing or making decisions about our reproductive rights. And all of these things are interwoven. They're all connected. They still go back to this piece of racial trauma. And so I personally kind of think that there's an opportunity here, especially for folks who are in the audience, if maybe you're noticing trends, maybe even within your respective organization, where there are folks who are like, no, we're kind of sunsetting, we're moving into a different direction. I gotta ask, is it because of folks who are at a space of recognizing maybe there's actually white fragility in the room, and there's a fear to actually go more radically and more deeper towards a trajectory where we're actually really serving those who are the most marginalized? Or is there a piece where we still want to keep that status quo where the system is, yeah, Black folks can kind of somewhat have some of these things, Native folks some of the things, brown folks some of the things, but the overarching thing is the theme still needs to be led, particularly by this governance of whiteness. And when I speak to that, I'm speaking about the system of it. And I think it actually takes all of us, one by one. These conversations need to be had in our households. They need to be had with our friends. They need to be had in our respective communities so that when we are showing up in the workplace, we are thinking of our values. Because at the end of the day, this is about legacy. This is even beyond philanthropy. We are going to pass the baton on. The same thing with even climate justice, that conversation. It still has undertones that are still connected to racial violence. And so my ask really in the room is for folks to be actually thinking critically and deeply about what kind of legacy, when history looks back at what you did at this time, what will it say of what you did?
That's amazing. Susan?
Yeah, we really need traditional indigenous knowledge, ecological knowledge in these times. We really do, because the reality is that, indigenous people lived sustainably on these lands for thousands and thousands of years. And here we are in a crisis situation, right? A horrible crisis situation. And we can call upon the indigenous peoples because that knowledge, even though communities have been just decimated, that knowledge lives in our hearts, it lives in our bodies, it lives in our land, it lives in the practices and the way that we live our lives. And so we really want to, at Illahee Fund, we just work to strengthen them, strengthen that knowledge, bring it back together with sharing, and we're open to share.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Mm-hmm. Rachel?
I very much agree that there is an opportunity in the midst of the challenge and a place for bringing people together to talk about, to learn together, to commit together, to push back against the resistance that we're experiencing around equity, around inclusion, around racial justice. And so I think what we're seeing right now is that there are a lot of organizations, foundations, philanthropies, businesses that aren't sure what to do. They're afraid and are kind of retrenching against original promises. But there are also organizations that are stepping up and saying, we are going to continue to support what we think is right. We are committed to this and are willing to work together. And so I think that piece of bringing people together to learn in community and to develop and to support as we see that retrenchment, that pushing back, is what's really necessary to get us through.
That's phenomenal. Any other thoughts on this subject? No. One of the things that often, I don't know how many of you in this audience today get an opportunity to be on a stage like this. Just before we got started, I was sitting in the back with these wonderful ladies, and it was phenomenal. I wish you could have been a fly on the wall to see them all chatter. And the reason why I say that is these wonderful organizations, these wonderful women, they all have collaborated before, and they're going to collaborate again. And as we're having all these deep discussions, it's important to think not only to hold all this information in for yourself. Our goal and our model is to share with others because our knowledge is in group. Our power is together, not on one. So with my, Kat, do you have something to, no? Okay. With our final question, what do you guys feel as the takeaways from this conversation? What can we each do within our organizations and sphere and influence to make an impact?
So I think I was supposed to put this in the other question, but that's okay. I just want to talk about business. I mean, I came here trying to really reflect on how I can do a better job as a philanthropist and how the sector can measure up better at this time, which is a really pretty critical time on many fronts. But I think we have to reform business for philanthropy to actually be effective too, and government as well. And I'm a real optimist about the power of business for good. It really can do amazing things. As I said, business and our economy drive way more societal outcomes than government and philanthropy combined. So we should get it right. I am a big believer in stakeholder capitalism. An economy that drives benefit to all and harm to none, which it is fully capable of doing. And it is not just a rule-based kind of economy, it's cultural. We can look, it's a back to the future civilization strategy. 45,000 years, the longest standing indigenous peoples of the world lived with ecological commons in balance with each other. And we just need to remember that, taught by elders, and build it into our business systems as well. So Beneficial State Bank is a great example, I think. I mean, selfish, self-centered saying, but it's a triple bottom line American corporation that's incorporated as a B corporation. It serves economic resiliency, social justice, and environmental well-being in equal measure. It's the better way to make a buck in banking. We think about our activities across 6 broad areas to make sure they're all aligned with public purpose governance. So 100% of the economic rights are owned either by government or public charity foundations, which means that those shareholders are not insisting that we maximize profit by underpaying our colleagues, overcharging customers, and throwing our garbage over the fence. They're asking us to meet that triple bottom line. The second area we pay a lot of attention to is our lending and investing practice. Banks and financial service institutions are really powerful. They're the biggest sector in the economy. They drive every other economy. They have at least 10 times leverage. Where they invest and lend their money really, really matters. So we guardrail our lending practice to make sure that we are not supporting economic activity that's harming us, like fossil fuel development, private prisons, extractive finance, and rather we dedicate our capital to things that are healing the earth and restoring justice, like fair economic inclusion, clean energy solutions, community-led economic development. Mission at the core of every product and service. Your toaster shouldn't blow up in your kitchen, neither should your mortgage. That's what Elizabeth Warren said. So we try to make sure that every product and service that we offer makes you healthier the day after than you were the day before. It has to live up to mission purpose. Our corporate practices, we need to behave as a corporation in a responsible way to all of our stakeholder groups. And we include in our stakeholder groups not just our equity shareholder, but the communities that we serve, the colleagues with whom we are privileged to work, the customers whom we wish to empower, the environment upon which we all depend, and the public interest at large. So, for instance, we pay a living wage. We don't pay our employees just to work, we pay them to live. It's the decent and fair thing to do, and it attracts a better talent pool and retains them. We measure our landfill carbon and water footprint every year and try to drive it down. Those are just some of the corporate practices. We're also unionized, first bank in 40 years to be unionized. Transparency and accountability. We measure everything we do, we subject it to third-party audit, and we report it so that it is transparent what we are doing. We submit to many, many certifications and measurement audits, basically from B Corporation to Community Development Financial Institutions, Global Alliance for Banking on Values, the UN Principles of Ethical Banking. We have to do that because we won't understand if we are doing the right thing, and we won't explore what we're doing incorrectly unless we have that kind of information. And then lastly, advocacy. We will not advocate in our self-interest. Any advocacy we do has to be in the public interest. This is not an unusual thing for corporations to do. They could all do this. We should insist that they all do this because we're going to have to get to an economy that's based more on mutualism if we wish not to be spit out by the planet like watermelon seeds or go down to mass diaspora and rioting. We need capitalism to work for us. It will only do that if it's stakeholder capitalism. I haven't given up on it yet, but I think it's time to turn our attention to our economy and make sure that it is what it means in Greek, the management of our home.
That's why I'm so proud to work here. How about Valley?
Sure. I think what comes to mind for me is, just maybe a call to action. I think we should be comfortable with conspiring for good. I say this because my coworkers, I call them my co-conspirators. I promise you. And the reason being is we should be looking at how certain systems are clearly not designed to ensure that the most marginalized communities are uplifted. But what are ways in which we can show up and be more radical and get used to moving in that trajectory? I say this to say, some of you all might have heard, there is currently a migrant crisis that's happening in Tequila. There are around 410 Venezuelan, Angolan, and Congolese communities, many of whom are unhoused and are currently sleeping in tents. And yet they're located in a capita that has some of the most wealthiest people living here. So I say this to say that when we hear things that are happening in our community, much of that work or activism actually starts with us caring about those simple things and really actually being about good trouble. We shouldn't think that to do this work, that it should come like cookie cutter, it should be convenient. I actually think that if the work is inconvenient, it's actually speaking to the times and where we're going and what we're supposed to do. Because if this life was easy, everybody would have signed up for the same thing. So I just want to put that out there, that if you are in the business of doing this work and you're recognizing even if compassion fatigue is showing up, talk to your community members, devise certain plans, but get used to being radical. Because if we're actually going to make history, it's because of the diligence and the commitment to really conspire for good.
That's amazing. Rachel?
I love that, conspiring for good. And I would just add to that, this work is difficult. It's not easy. And doing it in community brings joy and makes it more effective. So we're not going it alone. We're learning from one another. We're learning what worked for you might work for me. Maybe I'll shift it a little bit. But when we collaborate in that way, when we don't look at each other as competition, but as partners, it really gets us a lot further, a lot faster. So.
Truth in numbers, I love it.
I just want to echo the partnership piece. Competition just doesn't serve us in this area, right? It just doesn't. We can get so much more accomplished when we collaborate with each other and really build our bridges and help each other out. I'm still inspired by philanthropy through all of its faults. Yes, yes, yes. I stick with it because I believe in it. And I believe that as humans, we step up to do the right thing when called to, and we are in that time right now for sure. I think that's one thing that's coming out today. And so that's what we do, right? We call on each other to step up. Yeah, thanks.
So there's the one aspect of this that I want to call attention to, just again, on kind of behalf of nonprofit organizations, which is that nonprofit organizations always feel like they're in a one-down situation with philanthropy, right? Some of that is just economic power, right? Some of it is just because it's a world we're not behind the wall, right? We don't necessarily understand the world. One of the one thing that I would ask of philanthropy that would be just a good place to start in allowing nonprofits to be a part of this collaboration is that philanthropy often talks as if, like, philanthropy is addressing intergenerational poverty. Philanthropy is turning back the forces of climate change. Philanthropy is correcting the impact of racism on health. But people do the work. Dollars don't do the work. And so the people that are doing that work somehow need to be brought into the equation, partly because they have the knowledge, and because if there is a way forward that's going to be transformative, they have to be a part of the conversation. And generally, you know, when nonprofits are talking to philanthropy, it's basically in a, you know, go along, get along kind of mode, because people are seeking support, and philanthropy is a very complicated world to interact with. And very often, you know, I have a set of stories, which I think most nonprofit executive directors have, of coming away from interactions and relationships where you really got put in your place. And it reminds you what your place is, and your place is you belong in a different world than the rarefied world of philanthropy. So somehow for this to work, because of all the sectors, what should be most aligned, right? Philanthropy should be more aligned with nonprofits than with business or government. Government should be more aligned with nonprofits than business. If business had the enlightenment that you're talking about, they would recognize that they actually have better, more sustainable futures if they were to align with some of the values that you're talking about in philanthropy and in nonprofits. But it's very hard for nonprofits to be a part of that transformation as long as they are looked down upon, which is why people feel like they're getting paid what they're being paid, because they're being paid the way they're valued in our society, and that is not actually what their worth is.
I thank you all so much for being here today. I hope that all of you take a moment to listen to some of these important aspects that these wonderful women have brought up today. But I want to make sure you guys want to give them a wonderful round of applause and thank them for their time today. So this concludes our event portion of this day. So if you guys want, you can go ahead and step up and go back down the way you came. We're gonna have some drinks, snacks, and I hope that this conversation keeps going with all of you. There is no one organization that is alone here. I hope this invokes a lot of conversation. Pretty much everyone in this room is either a philanthropist or a nonprofit or some mission-aligned organization. So walk up to someone you don't know today. Have a conversation. You'd be amazed at what you can collaborate and make magic. Thank you all.